Here is the thing nobody tells you about. The dark side of empathy. Your goodness has a shadow. The people who do the most damage to relationships, to families, to themselves, are not the ones who know they are dangerous. They are the ones who are absolutely convinced they are not. They are the patient ones, the understanding ones, the ones who always take the high road. And the reason this matters, the reason Carl Jung spent 50 years trying to warn us about it, is that the bigger your goodness, the bigger the shadow it casts. Now I know how that sounds, and I know some of you are already composing a rebuttal in your head. So before you do, let me tell you what Jung actually found when he spent decades studying not criminals, not sociopaths, not people who had obviously gone off the rails, but the most self-described moral, spiritual, empathetic people of his era. What he found was that those people were often carrying the most volatile, the most pressurized, and the most destructive shadow of all. In the next however many minutes, we are going to break down 4 specific archetypes, 4 shadow profiles that live inside good people, that are slowly dismantling their relationships, their bodies, and their sense of who they actually are. Jung called this work the moral achievement of a lifetime. I think by the end of this, you will understand exactly why he used that phrase. Let us start where the discomfort starts. In 1951, Carl Jung published Ion, one of the most psychologically demanding texts he ever produced. Inside it, buried between passages that most readers skim past, he made a claim that should have sent a shock through the entire field. He wrote that the shadow is not simply the dark side of human nature in the abstract. It is the dark side specifically of the parts of ourselves that we are most proud of. The parts we have cultivated, presented, and in many cases built our entire identity around. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Read that slowly. The less you acknowledge your shadow, the more convinced you are of your own virtue, the more dense, more concentrated, and ultimately more destructive it becomes. This is not a metaphor. This is a mechanism, and it operates in some of the most impressive people you have ever met. Jung's concept of the shadow refers to the unconscious warehouse of everything the ego has refused to claim. Everything you were told was wrong, unacceptable, or dangerous about yourself when you were young. Your anger, your ambition, your hunger, your grief, your desire for power, your sexuality, your capacity for cruelty, all of it gets pushed into this psychological basement. Not eliminated, not dissolved, stored, and stored things do not stay quiet forever. In his 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung made the relationship between persona and shadow explicit. The persona, the face we construct for the world, and the shadow operate in inverse proportion. The more flawless the persona, the more swollen and pressurized the shadow underneath it, which means the most empathetic, the most spiritually advanced, the most endlessly patient people in your life may also be carrying the most concentrated darkness, not because they are hypocrites, but because the project of maintaining a perfect persona requires the continuous, relentless suppression of everything that contradicts it. That is not an indictment. It is an invitation. Because here is what Jung believed with absolute conviction. You cannot outrun your shadow by building a better persona. You cannot exhaust it with meditation. You cannot transcend it with spiritual practice. You can only, eventually, painfully, necessarily, look at it. And when you do, what you find is not what you expected. Let us look at 4 specific profiles of how this plays out. Consider a case profile that reflects one of the most consistently documented patterns in depth psychology. Picture the repressed defender type. Everyone in this person's life has a version of the same story about them. They are the one who never escalates, the one who absorbs. When things get heated in a meeting, they are the first to de-escalate. When their family is in crisis, they are the stable one. When a relationship becomes tense, they are the one who backs down and later tells themselves it was the mature decision. From the outside, this looks like emotional intelligence. From the inside, it is a prison. Here is what is actually happening. The repressed defender does not avoid conflict because they have evolved beyond anger. They avoid it because at some formative point in their development, usually in response to a volatile parent, an unpredictable home environment, or a social world that punished assertion, they made an unconscious conclusion that their anger was not just inconvenient, but existentially threatening. That if they let it out, something irreversible would happen. So they sealed it off. They built an identity. I am a peaceful person. I do not get angry like that. And they have been maintaining that identity ever since. But the anger did not disappear. It went underground. Robert Awe Johnson, in his 1991 work Owning Your Own Shadow, described this dynamic with real precision. He wrote that whatever we refuse to live on the bright side of life becomes shadowed, and that it will eventually erupt, but never cleanly, never at the appropriate moment, and never in a form we recognize as anger. It comes out sideways. This is what the eruption looks like in the repressed defender type. Not a confrontation, not a clear, decisive argument that might actually resolve something. Instead, a slow withdrawal, an inexplicable coldness that the person themselves cannot fully explain. A pattern of psychosomatic complaint, chronic jaw tension, shoulder pain, digestive problems, because the body has had to absorb what the psyche refused to express. A creeping resentment that coats every interaction like oil on water, invisible but suffocating. And eventually, without warning to anyone, including themselves, a total collapse of a relationship they would have told you last month was completely fine. They did not choose any of that. The shadow chose it for them. Now here is where Jung gets difficult, because he made an argument that most people in the self-help world have been carefully avoiding for decades. He argued that a person is not morally praiseworthy for never having harmed anyone. That is not goodness. That is harmlessness. And harmlessness, Jung insisted, is not the same thing as virtue. Here is the distinction he was drawing. Genuine moral character requires that a person possesses the full capacity for power, for assertion, for force, for the full expression of their primal vitality. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com, and then makes a conscious, deliberate choice about how to use it. Jung was not romanticizing cruelty here. He was making a deeper point, that the shadow is not simply the seat of darkness, it is the seat of creative energy. The shadow holds your drive, your ferocity, your hunger, your will to survive. When you cut yourself off from all of that in the name of being good, you do not become more virtuous. You become less whole. And a less whole person is not a safer one. They are simply a less conscious one. The difference between a lion who chooses not to eat you and a rabbit who simply cannot eat you is not a semantic one. It is the difference between a person who is genuinely at peace and a person who is merely incapable. Ask yourself this question honestly. When you back down from conflict, when you take the high road, when you let something go rather than address it, is that a choice you are making from a place of real power? Or is it the only move you know how to make? Edward Edinger, Jung's student and the author of Ego and Archetype in 1972, described the integration task for this archetype as the development of what he called harmful competence. The term sounds alarming. It is meant to. Not because the goal is to become harmful, but because the goal is to become capable. to develop the actual, functional ability to set a boundary without immediately softening it, to say no, and let the discomfort of that no sit in the room without rushing to clean it up. To access the assertive, self-protective, primal energy that the shadow has been keeping in storage, and bring it into conscious service. To discover, perhaps for the first time, that your anger is not your most dangerous quality. It is one of your most vital ones, because it is the energy that knows what you are worth, and denying it does not make you peaceful. It makes you a pressure cooker with no release valve. But that pressure cooker dynamic, it gets even more interesting when the person applying the pressure is convinced they are doing it for your benefit. The next shadow does not wear the face of patience. It wears the face of love. A composite example based on patterns that emerge consistently in psychoanalytic and relational literature, the protective tyrant. This person would pass any surface assessment of devotion. They show up, they provide, they make plans, contingencies, backup plans. If you are in their life, they are thinking about your well-being constantly, almost without pause. And they will tell you this. They will tell everyone, with complete sincerity, that everything they do comes from care. Here is what makes this shadow almost impossible to see from inside it. They are not lying. The protective tyrant does not know they are a tyrant. They genuinely experience their need to manage, arrange, monitor, and control the people they love as love. Because at the level at which they are operating, it is love. It is just love that has been completely colonized by terror. Jung identified this dynamic through what he described as the negative aspect of the animus and anima archetypes, the shadow side of the caretaking instinct. He connected it directly to the archetype he called the trickster, the principle of inherent chaos, the element of reality that simply refuses to be governed. The protective tyrant is in a lifelong war with the trickster. Every call to check in, every itinerary planned down to the minute, every gentle but firm suggestion about how a loved one should handle their situation, all of it is a defensive operation against a world that once showed this person, catastrophically, what happens when things are not managed. Because the wound underneath the protective tyrant is almost always a wound of unpredictability. A parent who disappeared without warning. A financial collapse that arrived without signal. A loss so sudden and so absolute that the psyche drew a conclusion it has never revised. If I am not watching, something terrible will happen. And so they watch. Constantly. With love. Jung himself would have framed this through what he called a complex, specifically the mother or father complex, in which an early relational wound with a primary caregiver becomes so deeply embedded in the unconscious that it shapes every subsequent relationship the person forms. The wound does not present itself as a wound. It presents as personality, as attentiveness, as love. It is worth noting that modern attachment theory, developed independently by John Bowlby and operating in an entirely different psychological tradition, arrived at strikingly parallel observations. Bowlby's concept of anxious, preoccupied attachment, in-I, which a person's internal working model of the world, is organized around the belief that safety must be continuously manufactured through vigilance, maps closely onto what Jung was describing in analytical psychology terms. Two frameworks, different lineages, the same human pattern. At its core, a belief formed early and operating unconsciously, that the world is fundamentally unsafe and that the only adequate response to that unsafety is to never stop watching. The hypervigilance is not arrogance. It is a very old, very scared part of a person doing the only thing it ever learned to do. But here is where the shadow becomes the problem, because the people around the protective tyrant, the children, the partners, the colleagues, the friends, are not experiencing love. They are experiencing surveillance dressed as love. and they often cannot say so, because the moment they push back against the control, the shadow's response is immediate and genuine: betrayal. After everything I do for you, the shadow genuinely does not understand that protection without consent is not protection. It is a cage built from affection. And crucially, the protective tyrant's need to control the outer world is a projection. It is not really about the people they love. It is about a raging internal disorder, an anxiety, a grief, a chaos, that they have never been willing to sit with directly. Controlling the external world is far more manageable than confronting the internal one. The integration of this shadow is not, as many therapists frustratingly tell their clients, simply to trust more or let go. That instruction lands as meaningless to a shadow this entrenched, because the anxiety it is managing is real, even if its strategies are destructive. The deeper work, the Jungian work, is a deliberate confrontation with the trickster itself, allowing an outcome you cannot predict or control to simply occur. Sitting with the anxiety that follows without immediately reaching for a lever to pull, surviving it, and then doing it again and again, until the psyche slowly, grudgingly, updates its original verdict that the world does not require your constant management to stay intact, that the people you love can make choices you would not have made and not be destroyed, and that you can watch that happen without it destroying you. Now, both of the archetypes we have covered so far are relatively easy to see in other people, even if they are invisible to the people living them. But the next, shadow, is different, because it is built inside a language that our culture celebrates. It hides not behind patience or care, but behind something we are all told is the pinnacle of emotional development. It hides behind spirituality, a narrative illustration drawn from a pattern observed consistently across psychodynamic clinical work. The resentful saint type has almost always experienced what therapists call narcissistic injury, a deep, disproportionate wound inflicted by someone they trusted completely. The betrayal took something essential from them, and in the aftermath, they responded the way their community, whether therapeutic, spiritual, or religious, taught them was correct. They chose forgiveness, or rather they performed it. And over time, with enough journaling and breathwork and social media statements about growth and healing, they began to believe their own performance. What makes this shadow so clinically significant is that the tools being used to suppress it are themselves sophisticated and genuinely valuable. Mindfulness is real. Gratitude practice is real. The desire to not be consumed by bitterness is real and healthy. None of these things are wrong. The problem is when they are deployed not as genuine processing, but as a bypass, as a way to get to the destination of healed without making the actual journey through the territory of furious. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator and one of the most important Jungian analysts of the 20th century, described this pattern with uncomfortable precision in Shadow and Evil in fairy tales. She wrote extensively about what happens when a person's spiritual or moral identity becomes so inflated, so thoroughly polished, that it develops a shadow of its own. She called this the shadow of the saintly persona, the spiritual ego that has grown so dominant in the conscious identity that the repressed, unsanctified impulses beneath it are forced underground rather than integrated. The result is someone who is acutely, almost supernaturally sensitive to moral failures in other people, while being genuinely invisible to the resentment festering inside themselves. They do not experience it as resentment. They experience it as discernment, as wisdom, as the natural consequence of having done the work and being able to see clearly what others cannot. But here is the clinical picture of what the suppressed rage actually produces. It does not stay quiet. It gets routed. It comes out in health problems. Because the body, as Bessel van der Kolk documented so rigorously in his clinical research, does not distinguish between an emotion that was expressed and an emotion that was suppressed. It stores both. What it does with suppressed emotion is less clean than what it does with expressed emotion. James Pennebaker's decades of research at the University of Texas on emotional suppression demonstrated this with striking physiological specificity. People who chronically suppress strong negative emotions, particularly anger and grief, show elevated cortisol levels, suppressed immune function, and increased inflammatory markers. The body keeps the score precisely because the mind has refused to. The resentment also comes out relationally. The resentful saint, without ever raising their voice or saying a genuinely cruel word, can make the people around them feel quietly, inexplicably judged. There is a chill underneath the warmth, a performance in the compassion, and people feel it. They just cannot name it. Because how do you tell someone their forgiveness feels hostile? Psychologist John Welwood coined the term spiritual bypass in 1984 to describe exactly this pattern, the use of spiritual ideals and practices to avoid confronting unresolved emotional issues. The spiritual bypass does not look like denial, it looks like evolution. That is what makes it so difficult to name and so costly to maintain. The integration of this shadow is not a pivot away from spirituality, it is an expansion of it. It is the recognition that rage, honest, clear, boundaried rage at a genuine violation, is not a sign of low emotional development. It is information. The psyche produces it for the same reason the body produces pain, to signal that something is wrong and needs to be addressed. When you suppress pain, you do not heal faster. You lose the signal that tells you where the wound is. Honoring the anger does not mean weaponizing it. It means meeting it, saying, yes, what happened was wrong. I am allowed to be furious about that. And only from that honest ground, not from the performance of having already gotten past it, can any real forgiveness eventually take root. Because a forgiveness you performed is not a forgiveness you have. It is a debt you are carrying, with interest. And now, we arrive at the fourth shadow, the one that requires the most courage to look at, because this one is not about anger or control or spiritual performance. It is about desire, about wanting, about the specific torture of watching someone else have the thing you have spent years convincing yourself you do not want. Before we go any further, we need to get precise about something, because most people conflate two completely different emotional experiences under the same word, and that confusion is itself a shadow mechanism. Jealousy is the fear of losing something you already possess. It is threat-based. It is backward-looking. You are jealous when you sense someone might take what is already yours. Envy is categorically different, and the distinction matters enormously. Envy is the pain you feel at someone else's gain, specifically when that gain illuminates something you have told yourself you are not the kind of person who wants or deserves. Psychologist Richard Smith, in his academic text, Envy, Theory and Research, identifies envy's signature feature as shame. The sting is not just that someone else has something. It is that the part of you that wants it feels like evidence of your worst self, which is precisely why it gets buried, and which is precisely why, buried, it does so much damage. A composite example based on observed psychodynamic patterns. Picture a type who has constructed their identity around a particular form of non-attachment. They meditate, they practice contentment, they genuinely believe, or have deeply convinced themselves they believe, that they have no particular hunger for recognition, status, success, or wealth. They would find it embarrassing to admit otherwise. They have made "I am not driven by ego" a core feature of who they are. And then someone close to them succeeds, visibly, publicly, in a domain that this person has privately, quietly, desperately wanted to be recognized in for years. Something moves in the basement. It does not announce itself as envy. It is too sophisticated for that. It, arrives first as a critical assessment. The achievement, examined closely, is not as significant as people are saying. There is something slightly overrated about it. Then it arrives as distance, subtle, plausibly explained, a slight reduction in availability. Then it arrives as a mission, forgetting to share the colleague's work, neglecting to make an introduction that might help them, somehow never finding the right moment to offer the public acknowledgement that would take 30 seconds and cost nothing. And through all of this, the conscious mind genuinely believes it is acting neutrally, because it has no access to what is happening in the basement. The shadow has no obligation to report in. Here is where the Jungian framework produces one of its most genuinely useful insights. In Jung's model, what the shadow envies in others is almost never actually about the other person. The envy is navigational. It is pointing at a suppressed potential, something you have disowned in yourself, branded as inappropriate or unavailable, or simply not the kind of thing someone like you pursues. The friend's recognition does not trigger envy because you want their specific achievement. It triggers it because somewhere in you is a version of yourself who wanted that kind of recognition and was told by a parent, a teacher, a critical inner voice, the simple experience of failure, that it was not for them. The envy is not your worst quality. It is your most honest map. Brené Brown's research on shame and vulnerability at the University of Houston consistently found that the suppression of ambition and desire, particularly in people who have internalized the message that wanting things makes you greedy or shallow or spiritually unadvanced, creates one of the most potent breeding grounds for shame-based behavior. People who cannot admit what they want become, with time, quietly resentful of anyone who has it. Not because they are bad people, because the want does not go away. It just gets redirected into contempt. The integration of the covetous shadow is not complicated. It is just uncomfortable. It requires sitting with a specific question, honestly, without rushing to the exit of self-criticism or rationalization. What does this person have that I have been telling myself I am not allowed to want? What would I need to believe about myself? What risk would I need to take? What identity would I need to revise to actually pursue that? The answer to that question is not a source of shame. It is an instruction manual, because the shadow will keep sending you those signals through every dismissal, every piece of contempt, every moment of inexplicable distance towards someone you claim to support. It will keep pointing at the door until you open it. Now let us stand back and look at all four of these archetypes at the same time, because I want you to see what they have in common and what they are collectively costing. The repressed defender, the protective tyrant, the resentful saint, the covetous shadow. On the surface, they look completely different. One avoids conflict, one creates it through control, one transcends it through spirituality, one denies it through practiced contentment. But underneath all four, the mechanism is identical. At some point, in childhood, in adolescence, in early adulthood, each of these people encountered a part of themselves that felt dangerous, shameful, or fundamentally incompatible with who they were trying to become. And they did what every human psyche instinctively does with something that feels threatening. They rejected it. They pushed it down, locked the door, and built a more presentable life on top of it. And then they spent years wondering why the foundation kept cracking. Jung was blunt about this in a way that made him deeply unpopular in certain circles. He argued that the most dangerous psychological state is not belonging to a person who knows they are capable of destruction. It is the state of the person who has become genuinely convinced that they are not, because that person has no access to their shadow. They cannot see it approaching. They cannot contain its eruption when it comes. And when it does erupt, and Jung was categorical on this point, it always does. It devastates everything around it in ways the person will never be able to fully trace or understand. Consider a pattern that longitudinal relational research has captured with striking consistency, a dynamic that couples therapists and clinical psychologists encounter repeatedly across contexts. A person who has spent years in a role of extreme emotional generosity, the giver, the absorber, the one who holds space for everyone else, eventually crosses a threshold, not because of a single dramatic moment, but because decades of unacknowledged need accumulate into a weight that simply cannot be sustained. And when the collapse comes, it comes fast. The relationships around this person are blindsided because the persona never showed them a warning sign. The face was always composed. The voice was always measured. Until one day, absolutely without signal, it was not. And then the people who depended on that accommodation are left trying to understand what happened, while the person at the center, finally, for the first time, acting from their actual interior, is also confused, because they have spent so long performing equanimity that they have lost the ability to distinguish between the performance and themselves. This is the shadow's invoice. And it arrives without warning precisely because it was never allowed to send smaller statements along the way. The body compounds this. The research literature, stretching across 70 years, strongly suggests a significant correlation between chronic emotional suppression and measurable physiological stress responses. From Alexander and French's foundational 1948 text, Psychosomatic Medicine, through Pennebaker's suppression studies, through Gabor Mate's clinical documentation in When the Body Says No, the pattern documented is consistent: elevated cortisol, suppressed immune function, increased inflammatory markers, and in many cases a contributing relationship to autoimmune conditions. The medical community is careful to note that causation in mind-body research is complex and multifactorial. These are contributing dynamics, not singular causes. But the correlation is documented, it is robust, and it is hard to look at without taking seriously. The body is not a passive container for what the mind refuses to feel. It is an active participant. And when the mind closes the door on an emotion, the body opens another one. The shadow will find a way out. It always has. The only question before you is whether you choose the door yourself, or whether it chooses the wall. Here is what I think Jung understood, that most of us have not yet accepted. The shadow is not your enemy. That is the counterintuitive, difficult, necessary center of everything he built. The shadow is not the part of you that needs to be eliminated. It is the part of you that you abandoned, the part that was too loud, too hungry, too angry, too ambitious, too real for the life you were trying to construct. And it has been waiting, patiently, darkly, with remarkable persistence, for you to come back and claim it. In his later writing, Jung described the integration of the shadow using a metaphor from medieval alchemy, a process he called the coniunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites, the union of the conscious and unconscious that produces something neither element could generate alone. Robert A. Johnson, elaborating on this concept in Owning Your Own Shadow, wrote that shadow integration is not about becoming darker, it is about becoming more real, and I think that word real is the one that matters most here. Look at what integration actually produces for each of the 4 archetypes we have walked through today. The repressed defender who integrates their shadow does not become violent. They become, perhaps for the first time, genuinely safe, because their peace is now a choice made from the full awareness of what they are capable of choosing against. That is not harmlessness. That is virtue. The protective tyrant who integrates their shadow does not suddenly abandon the people they love to the chaos they fear. They discover, slowly, with enormous resistance, that a love which does not require control is a love that can actually be received, that the people in their life have been grateful for their care and quietly suffocating from their management, sometimes simultaneously, for years. The resentful saint who integrates their shadow does not abandon forgiveness. They arrive at a forgiveness that is actually earned, that was built on the honest ground of acknowledged anger, of named violation, of a deliberate decision made from a full and honest starting point rather than from a performance of altitude. And the covetous shadow, who finally looks at their envy, does not become greedy. They become honest. They stop spending their energy quietly undermining people who have what they want and start spending it pursuing what they want, which is a complete transformation in both their relationships and their work. I want to say something directly here because I think it matters. Our culture has built an entire industry around the project of becoming a better version of yourself, lighter, more controlled, more evolved, less reactive, less angry, less wanting, less afraid. And there is genuine value in some of that. But Jung's insight, which I believe is one of the most important things he ever produced, is that this project, taken to its logical conclusion, produces not a better person, but a more dangerous one. Because every quality you exile from your conscious identity does not disappear. It grows in the dark into something that has no relationship with your values or your intentions. The goal is not to become lighter. The goal is to become whole. And wholeness includes the parts you are ashamed of, the parts you are afraid of, the parts that do not fit the story you have been telling about yourself for 20 years. Jung wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." That is not a metaphor about being willing to suffer. It is a statement about the relationship between depth and height, about the fact that the person who has descended into their own shadow, who has sat in the basement, in the dark, and met what lives there, is the only person who can stand in the light and be trusted with it. So let me leave you with something specific, not an abstract challenge, a single concrete question that Jung essentially spent his career posing in different forms. What is the part of yourself that you are most proud of not being? Think about that carefully. The emotion you do not have, the ambition that is beneath you, the anger that you are too evolved to feel, the desire you would be embarrassed for anyone to know about, the thing that twists in you, briefly, quickly, before you suppress it. When someone else gets something you have told yourself you do not want, that place, that exact place, that is where your shadow is. And your shadow is not your worst self. It is your most honest one. It is the part of you that has been waiting with more patience than you deserve for you to stop performing your goodness long enough to come home to something real. The integration is not quick. It is not comfortable. It will ask things of you that your persona will resist fiercely, because your persona was built specifically to keep this door closed. But on the other side of that door is not the destruction you fear. It is the wholeness you have been imitating. That is what Jung found after 50 years, and that, I think, is worth the work. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.